Everybody doing okay? All right, good to see you guys. What a great time of worship. So thankful for our worship team each week as they give, and then even giving when they weren't expecting to give. And so Michelle came down sick and was here Friday practicing and everything, and just, got slammed with it. And so and I know there's others in our congregation that are not feeling well also, and so we're just going to pray for them to get well and get better. And so, and thankful for Chase. He had no idea he was about to take every kid in our church back there to the back, but he is going to rock it like it's nothing. And so anyways, good times. We're going to spend the night, and one of my favorite passages, if you got a Bible, you want to go grab it out. We'll look at it in just a moment in Hebrews chapter 13, so you can start locating it. Hebrews chapter 12, and you can locate it there. But I was just curious, and so do we have any runners? Like, you run, we got a couple of runners. Some of them run whether you like it or not. Like my kids, they don't even raise their hand, and they're forced to run cross country. And so, not really, they chose it. So just so you know, I didn't force them to do anything; they chose it. Has anybody ever run a marathon before, or a mini marathon? Anybody ever done that? Okay, some of y'all have. All right. Anybody ever run a 5K before? Yeah. Okay. All right. Some of you done that. So I got to be real with you. I've never run a marathon before, and I'll be honest, I don't know that I ever will. I have run a 5K before. I don't know if you'd call it running, but I completed the race. And so that's the one thing I hold on to. Maybe I'll do another one in the future, but it's those things. But one of the things that I've learned to really admire runners, especially I've watched my boys begin to run and do those things as they competed in cross-country events and things like that throughout from middle school to high school, and watch those things. I remember growing up, I remember my dad ran in some marathons in Louisville, and I remember being there along the side and cheering him in and then cheering him out, and as we throughout those races. And there's some unique things, I believe, though, that are different about running and very unique than a lot of other sports that we kind of often compete in. And in those things, some of the little things that, to begin with, and some of the things that, are kind of uniquely different, that I'll share some as we walk through this sermon today, or this message, that I think are uniquely different to racing than any other sport really on the face of the planet. But there's some things that happen when you run. And if you've ever run, especially a long distance, I don't know that I've ever run long enough to hit this point, but they call it the wall. That a lot of times when you're running, you'll run to the point and you kind of hit this wall. And and at that moment when you hit that wall, you kind of have a decision to make, right? You can choose to quit and drop out, or you continue through the wall. And somewhere at some point, I don't know where that is, and maybe some of you after the service can enlighten me on what point that is, so I can know that I can push through, and after that I'll be okay again, But when you get through that, it's something that takes, when you get through that wall and you finally get through it, it gives you the strength kind of to finish the race. Sometimes it's mentally in your mind that there's a point at the end, and you just continue to push yourself. But a lot of times for you to make it through that, you need to find something that'll help you kind of pace through it. It may be somebody who's in front of you that you just kind of run with them, and it just keeps you rolling and going, even through the hardest points of the race. Because everybody knows, if you've ever run, there's at some point you want to quit running. You want to stop running. You don't want to keep going. And you need something ahead that continues to push you forward. And then sometimes, and they often call it a pacer in the race, that helps pace and lead the pace. I've driven in the boys cross-country meets every year at the state races. They always have somebody that drives a mule, which is not a literal mule, but is these four-wheel machines, and I think it's really awesome. So I get out there and I lead that, and so I'll drive that through the race so that way they don't get off course. They know where to go. They continue to follow in case they're uncertain, and so you always have that. And then others in the race, sometimes you need somebody else who can help you keep the pace, that runs with you. There are people that can encourage you to keep that steady pace so you don't stop, because there's always that moment. And if you've run, that moment when you've wanted to stop, when you didn't want to keep going, when you were like, hey, it'd be easier just to stop right now, bow out, and be done. Because let's be real, in a marathon to make it to mile 20, much less 20, is impressive. To experience that and see that, to me, is like, whoa, oh my goodness, that you did that. But all of us, I believe, when it comes to this idea and what we're going to see today, we all need something or someone who's going to pace us out, that can help us keep going when we want to quit. When we hit the wall, because we will hit walls in our lives, when we don't want to keep going and we want to quit. And we need something that's out there that's keeping us pace, that keeps us going even when we don't want to go another inch. And I believe when we fix our eyes on that person, it keeps us going. Because we know if they keep going, if they've made it, then we can make it too. And so I want to encourage us with that tonight. We need those people that steadily encourage us, that have already finished, that we can keep our eyes on, even in those hardest moments and the hardest miles of the race that we will run. And life, I believe, oftentimes can seem like one long, arduous, grueling race. And there are moments when we have obstacles that often seem they're too great, they're impossible to overcome. We feel like quitting. We want to quit. And we have a choice. And I believe we need somebody along the way that can show us the way and inspire us to keep going. And that's what I want to give us today, so that we can experience joy in the season, even in the hardest moments of life. Even when it feels like I'm ready to give up, because let's be real, we've all, I believe, at some point probably been ready to give up. We've been ready to mail it in and be done, quit, drop out, tap out, whatever it may be. And we face those moments where we've been overwhelmed. Maybe it's with a loss. Maybe it's with a struggle even with our mental health. Maybe a broken relationship. Maybe it's simply just the weight of daily responsibilities. And to think to persevere would seem impossible. So when the burdens begin to pile up and we wonder, how do we keep going? How do we endure when we feel like it's just too much and we can't keep going? How do we find joy in those moments of life when they seem most hardest? And so I have a question for us to kind of consider, to wrestle around with this evening. One is this: is it possible to find joy and endurance in the midst of the struggle? Because there's days where we may not feel like we want to keep moving. There may be days where we feel like we've hit the wall and we can't take another step. And if it is possible, how do we do that? And my hope is tonight, before you leave, I don't know that it'll be earth-shattering to everyone, but I pray it'll remind you that we have somebody who set the pace, who we can keep our eyes on when we hit the wall. And if we keep our eyes on him, we can finish the race well. And I hope we'll be encouraged by that this evening. And so if you got a Bible, I want to invite you. Hebrews chapter 12 is where we're going to spend this evening together, breaking down the first 3 verses of this chapter. And I hope that they'll be helpful. And just so you can understand a little bit about the book of Hebrews, there's a lot that's happening here. But one of the big things is it was written to this group of people, these Christians, these followers of Jesus, who are facing great deals of persecution. There's struggle. There's great deals of discouragement. Anybody walked into work, maybe it was this past week, and you got hit with some discouragement because of something maybe somebody said or what they did, and you wanted to just get up, walk out, and go back home and get in bed? There's probably students in here that you got into school, and you walked into the classroom, and you thought, man, it's time for me to pick up my stuff and go back home because I just want to start this day over, and it just didn't go the way I anticipated. There's these moments in our life, and listen, this church was facing it. They had moments of incredibly painful moments of persecution and discouragement, and they were weary. And I believe they needed this encouragement that they were going to find to stay faithful, because we need those in that moment when we want to give up, when it feels like it's impossible to find joy in the midst of the situation we're in, when we feel like we don't have the endurance to keep going, when we want to give up and we want to stop and we want to bow out and tap out. We have a decision to make in that moment, what we will do. And these people did as well. And so in this beginning in chapter 12, where it begins by pointing to a group of people. And it's going to talk about as some translations talk about the cloud of witnesses, or those people that are surrounding them. It's actually pointing back to Hebrews chapter 11, and we often call it the Hall of Faith, or this group of people who have finished well, have finished the race, that weren't always perfect. And if you go back and read that list, what you need to know is many of them failed. Many of them had moments of falter, but they completed the race. And there's going to be moments where you feel like a failure, or you feel like you can't get it through, or you can't make it through. But if you'll stay faithful, if you remain locked on, then you can finish the race that God has called you to. And these people, I believe, give us the example of what it meant, despite hardship, despite pain, despite suffering. They remain faithful. And that's why there's that long list through chapter 11 of the Hall of Faith, of these people who kept the faith, finished the fight, and made it through. And that gives us hope as well too. And so Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, let's start there together. Therefore, it's talking about all those things. Therefore, because of all this, because of all these people that have lived this way, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith. And I want to encourage you with something right here at the beginning, is number one, that you would know and that I would know. We'd be reminded today, in case you forgot it, because sometimes we can feel in this life a great, overwhelming sense of being alone. But the truth is, in Christ, in Him, if you're running with Him, you and I, that we are not alone. You may want to write that down just to remind you, because there's going to be days we're going to question, I feel alone. I am alone. I feel like there's nobody else around. And what you need to know is you are never alone. This race that you're running, this life that you're living, you are not alone. Sometimes we can feel alone. Satan wants to tell us we're alone. But the truth is, because of all those other who's gone before us, we are not running this race alone. There are literally generations upon generation of other believers who are cheering us on to finish. These people who walked in faith with the Lord, whose lives were lived as a testimony to God's faithfulness in the midst of struggles, God's faithfulness in the midst of lions' dens, God's faithfulness in the midst of pain and suffering, loss and heartache. And I believe their lives remind us to persevere. To persevere, and not only that we should persevere, that perseverance is possible in our lives. I would encourage you to go back, maybe tonight before you go to bed or tomorrow morning when you wake up, and read just Hebrews chapter 11, that you'd be reminded of those who've made it through, that went through, and that we would know we don't stand here alone together, or by ourselves, because we are not alone. You and I are not alone. And then the writer then gives us this admonition, this thing, this to tell us. It says this in that next part of that verse, but let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. Let's be real. To run effectively, we've got to shed the weight that slows us down. Like no one would get out today and run in an official race and throw on a weighted vest or ankle weights. We would think that's silly, right? Because those things would do what? They would slow you down. Now, you may use those things in preparation in the race. There's moments and there's things that will help strengthen us, but we would never go out in those things, as they won't help us. And we need to consider these things. What weights in our lives may we have? What things may hinder us? And it may not be overt sin. It may not be overt other things. Listen, weights aren't always bad. They're not always the bad things of life. Sometimes the weights are actually the good things that keep us from the great things that God has for us. So we need to investigate and consider, like, what do I have in my life? What are the things that I've allowed in my mind? What are the things that I'm carrying today? And they may not all be bad, but they may be the things that are keeping you from the great things. Because just because they're good don't mean they're the greatest. And I'd encourage us in that because they can slow us down. They weigh us and keep us from our full potential or what God desires to do in and through us. And weights are those any things that can be distractions or burdens that unnecessarily slow us down, that keep us from running at the pace that we were meant to run at. And then he makes that final plea there in that part of that verse, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. The final warning there is against the sin that we do have, especially sin, especially those things that we've gotten tangled up in, those things that keep us, that may keep us from running at the full pace that we're meant to, because sin is meant, and if left unattended, will destroy us. We have to rid it from our lives. And the writer here knows that, because he knows for us to run at full potential, because sin will maybe feel good for a season. It may feel like, oh, it's given us what we need to run the race, but in reality, sin will always lead to trip us up. It will always trip you up. It will always knock you down. It will always leave you broken down. And so we need to strip off every weight that might slow us down, and especially the sin that's in our life. So maybe tonight for you, because for some of you, you may just need to consider, what are the good things that could be keeping me from the great things that God desires for me to do? But the other part, maybe for you, is to consider what's the sin that's crept into your life that maybe you haven't realized until just now, and you're like, oh, I need to deal with that. Because it's been tripping you up. You've been trying to run, but you keep falling over. You're trying to get up, but you keep running. And you keep falling. We need to make sure we address that and we get those things out of our life. And then he keeps going, and the writer says, and let us run. What's that word? With what? Endurance. The race that God has set before us. Listen, life is not for the faint at heart. I do not believe you can run this race alone, and we were never meant to be. That we are not alone in Jesus. But this life also requires that word, endurance. Because there's going to be moments where you're going to want to give up, you're going to want to pack it in, and you're going to want to go home. There's going to be moments where you want to quit, and you need endurance. It's the reason that in a race, we run at various paces depending on the times of the race and the distance of the race. And because our life is not a sprint, we need to develop endurance and that we pace ourselves out in the race. That if we constantly are sprinting, we will eventually crash out. But if we pace ourselves and keep our eyes on Jesus, we can get through the race. And that idea of that race that God has set before us suggests to me, and I believe to us all, that God has a purpose and He has a path for each of us. That each one of you that are in this room, God has a plan and God has a purpose. You weren't made by mistake, but you were made for a purpose and made on purpose to do something great for Him. And He has a race that's set before you. Not that you would run somebody else's race. And listen, as great as Frank's race is, Tim doesn't need to run Frank's race, and Frank doesn't need to run Tim's race. God set a race before them, and that they would run it and be faithful to the race that God's called them on. Because we're all uniquely gifted by Him to do something for Him and through Him. And He wants us to run the race that He's called us on. So let's commit together to run with endurance. Because the reality is, I may not be able to run at Frank's pace. I may not be ready to run at Dylan's pace. But God has made me to run my pace. And we need to be aware of that. So make sure we've got our eyes on the right race and the right one that's keeping the pace. And so I encourage us to that. Let's run with endurance. It takes endurance because there's going to be days you want to quit. I promise you. There's been days in the last month that I wanted to tap out and be done and run to the hills and find a cabin in the woods. But we got to keep going. Because God, I believe, has a plan and a purpose, and He wants to use us. That's why He called us on this. He set a race before us, each of us, to run. And then we continue on in the next verse, in verse 2, and it says this, and we do this, so, because let's be real, that sounds all great. I need to have endurance. I need to make it through. I need to do all these things. Life has, requires it and all this. But how am I supposed to do this? And the writer says this in verse 2, and we do all this by keeping our eyes on who? Jesus. On who do we keep our eyes on? Jesus. On who do we keep our eyes on? Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Just as a runner focuses on the finish line, focuses on the person who's leading the pace, that person who set it up and marks and keeps that steady pace, whoever it is, that just as a runner does that, we would fix our eyes on Jesus, keeping us moving forward with purpose. That Jesus is both the initiator, the example of it, but He's also the perfecter. He's the completer of our faith. And I believe it just means this, it's meaning what He starts, He finishes. He didn't just go, you know what, I think this is a good idea. No, He walked it. He started the journey, and He completed the journey. And the same thing I believe in mine and yours life as well too. That He's the one. That's how we keep going, because we keep our eyes on Him. The one who initiated it and the one who completed it. It's a whole lot easier to follow somebody who's completed the journey, isn't it? Versus somebody who just says, well, you guys should go run over there. And I'm like, what? It's a whole lot easier to follow somebody who not only starts the race, but they finish the race. Like, we would never take running advice from somebody who's to prepare for a marathon from somebody who's never run a marathon, right? So why would we put our eyes on anybody else other than Jesus, who started the race and He finished the race? Because what He started, He finishes. Which means, literally, He pursues us in this. And through that, our faith grows because of Him. Jesus is both, I believe, our example and the one who completes it. And by focusing our eyes on Him, we are aligning ourselves with His strength and His purpose and His will and His plans. So the next time we feel down or we feel uncertain, let's check where our eyes are. Are our eyes on all the things that are down and around here? The struggles that are right in front of me? Or are they on the one who's already completed the race? So that I can pace forward and make it through, even in life's toughest moments. And then he goes on and says this, because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Listen, Jesus faced the ultimate hardship, the ultimate struggle. And He wasn't motivated by the past things. He wasn't motivated by the things that He had even completed. He didn't focus on all the things, the healings and amazing things, and even on past things, but instead it said the joy that was ahead. He faced those hardships motivated by the joy that was ahead, the joy that awaited Him, which was the redemption of all humanity, fulfilling God's plan. Because His suffering had purpose, and it was our salvation. He looked beyond the immediate pain of His moment, The moment where he would endure the cross, disregarding the shame, to a joy that was ahead. And I believe Jesus, in this example, that he shows us that both joy and suffering can coexist when we understand the bigger picture. That when we find ourselves suffering, and we will suffer at times, that we can still experience joy because we know the suffering will be over. We know there's an end point to suffering, that one day when we see him face to face, there will be no more pain, no more sorrow, no more heartache, because we will look him full in his wonderful face. And so I encourage us in that denying that we'd be reminded that Jesus had joy even in the midst of heartache. And listen, the cross was one of the most painful, most excruciating mechanisms of death. And he endured it because the joy that was awaiting him. He even disregarded the shame of it, the public spectacle that he would be, and endured it because of the greater purpose of it. It was our salvation. That should blow our minds tonight. That Jesus looked on that and saw the greater joy in that moment. And then he continues on, and now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. That Jesus' work was completed, and he reigns now with authority. That is who he is. That is what he's done. That he went through all that. This is how we do it, because of what Jesus did. Not because what we have done, but because of what he's done. He endured the cross, took on even the shame of it. But there was a joy that was greater awaiting him, and that joy was that now he is seated in the place of honor besides God's throne. And here's what I believe this tells us, and what we should know today, is that Jesus' victory assures us that our struggles are never wasted. And I would imagine that for some of you, you've been through some struggle. And you've questioned, like, God, why am I going through this? God, I don't see a good plan in this. God, I didn't intend for this to be that way. But because of Jesus' victory, even the greatest struggles we may face, they are never wasted. They are never wasted at him. There may be moments of pain, and there will be. There may be moments of struggle. But we don't have to live our life in light of the struggle, but instead of the future glory that we will experience with Jesus and through Jesus. And we have moments of that we experience even now in our life when we follow him, when we keep our eyes on him. And so verse 3 is a great reminder. Because for a lot of us, does anybody have some problem people in your life? You may need to consider, don't look to the left or the right, because maybe that problem person's with you. I don't know. Don't look right now. But anybody got anybody that's just hard to get along with, that's a struggle, that gets under your skin? We all got people like that in our lives, right? You know, if you're a student, maybe it's one of your teachers. It's just like, oh, if I never have to see them again, God, could you go ahead and rapture me today? That would be good. Some of you got the boss. And you're like, God, tomorrow if you'd rapture them away, that'd be fine with me. It'd be good. I'd never have to see them again. And they could be wherever they go, and that's fine. I don't need to know. But just for them not, because we all got problem people. We all got struggle. You know, Jesus had that same thing. He endured. It says, think of all the hostility, it says in verse 3. That he endured from all the people that loved him, all the people that were on his side, everybody who followed him. No, all the hostility from all the sinful people. Anybody got any sinful people in their life they would love just to be out of their life because it feels like it would make their life a lot easier? You're tired of dealing with them? They could disappear, be fine. Because it'd make a whole life a whole lot easier. Of course, then we got to remember, on the other end of the spectrum, we're sinful people too. So let's not even go there. We'll just leave it right here at us and not get too much in our Kool-Aid today, okay? But like other people. There Jesus is. He endured those things, endured those people. From the sinful people that killed him. And it reminds us in this passage, then you won't become weary and give up. See, when our eyes are on Jesus, it helps us. It helps us to have endurance and perseverance. You may want to write this down. When we focus on Jesus' endurance, when we focus on Jesus' endurance, it empowers us to persevere. Because on our own, I can promise you, you will fail. Because there's days I'm ready to give up on some people. I'm ready to stop. I'm ready to be like, you can leave. But because Jesus showed us the way and what it looked like, it gives us strength to not grow weary and even give up. And the reason is, I believe, is because there are more people that need to know Jesus, and we may be the only Jesus they ever see. And would we be willing to even endure some hardship, even endure some struggle, faced with great opposition like Jesus is? As he faced more pain than any of us could ever imagine, yet he persevered for our sake. And listen, he understands our struggles and provides the strength, I believe, that we need. Like he went through the same things, endured people who that did anything they could to try to wreck him and wreck the ministry and wreck his life and then ultimately put him to death. And yet he endured it as well too. Jesus doesn't just tell us to persevere. He showed us how to persevere. That if you read through the Gospels, you see how he lived his life in a manner to please his heavenly Father, not even for his own self, to bring about change for all of us so that we could experience him. And he's not only our example, but he's also the source of strength for us all. And he understands the pain that we will go through, the walls that we will hit. And he walks with us through it. He goes through us with it. He's given his Holy Spirit to be with us. And he shows us the way to endure with joy, because our joy is not based on the momentary circumstances, but on the person and the joy that's ahead, because we know that one day all this suffering and struggle will end. And so what do? How can we make this like personal in our own life? I just want to give you 5 things that I hope will help you today as we walk out of this room. Some action steps just to be reminders that maybe you want to write down or put in your phone and maybe even consider posting up so it helps you be reminded of this day so that you can experience the joy that God has for you. The first thing would be reminded that we would just keep our eyes, that you would keep your eyes on Jesus. To keep your eyes on Jesus. That's the first thing I believe we need to do. And for you, it's to consider, what are you focusing on in the difficult season that you may find yourself in? Is it my own limitations, the size of the obstacle? Or is it on Jesus? And my encouragement for you is to do that. Maybe tomorrow it's to get up and begin each day by reflecting on who Jesus is, his love, his endurance, his victory, what he's done. We would do that. We would keep your eyes on Jesus. And the second thing you would do is that you would identify and shed the weight. It'd be the consideration of what's weighing you down. It could be fear or doubt or bitterness or distraction, anger, frustration. I don't know what it may be. But then maybe this evening, before you even walk out of this room, that you would take a moment to identify maybe some weights that are in your life and intentionally lay them aside, put them down through maybe prayer. And maybe you even need somebody to come alongside you because there's some struggle and some weight, some sin, and you need to confess it to another brother or sister that's in this room maybe even, so they can help you. They can encourage you to keep going when you don't want to. They can keep going because you start tripping and falling on it, and you do it over and over and over and over again, and it's time to get that out of your life so it doesn't control you anymore. It doesn't trip you up anymore. It doesn't keep you in the good, but moves you to the great things that God has for you. The third thing to be a reminder as well, that we would lean on Jesus. That we're not running this race alone. Jesus runs with us. He's in us. He gives us strength and encouragement in every step. When we may feel like giving up, He reminds us, listen, take my yoke upon you. For my weight is easy, my burden is light. That we would lean into Jesus. When things get hard, Satan would love nothing more than for us to pull away from Jesus. We can have temptation in those moments when struggle and stress and strife and turmoil come. But sometimes we begin to question, like, Jesus, are you good? Do you still care about me? And what we need to do in those moments is, yes, ask those questions we talked about last week when David lamented, that he expressed how he really felt. And he asked God, but he ultimately went back to God's character of who He was, that His love was never ending, that He was always there. And we would lean into Jesus. The fourth thing that we would do is run your race with perseverance. That you would run your race with perseverance. Understanding your journey is unique and God has equipped you for it. Now you would remember, I think for all of us, perseverance, it's more than a feeling. And it doesn't mean you're never going to be tired. Because there will be days you are tired. There will be days you are weary. But we would run the race with perseverance, with endurance. Knowing that He's the one that's called us on that race, and we would know that He's equipped us for the race. And then the last thing as well, that we'd be reminded that we'd embrace the joy that's set before you. That you'd embrace the joy that's set before you. That just like Jesus, who focused on the joy that was ahead and the purpose that was beyond the present hardship, that we would have our eyes ahead and embrace the joy that's to come. Maybe that we would consider and think about how we're being grown in the moment. In our faith, grown in the moment in our character and integrity, because we went through this struggle that was hard. It brought us to a greater place of faith. And consider maybe even the impact that your perseverance can yield as you live that life to follow Jesus. And that you can have joy in that God is making you and growing you into the person, that He is working to complete the good work that He started in you. That you would embrace the joy that's set before you. And when life feels overwhelming, that we'd remember that Jesus already ran the race and won the victory for us all. And that we would keep our eyes on Him. Let Him be the example. The presence, His presence that gives us strength and keeps us going even when we feel like giving up. And it's interesting. There's another thing that I've learned that's very unique about running, and especially races. I remember the phenomenon. I think Jonathan and Nate would have been probably in 7th or 8th grade. I can't remember. I think it was 7th grade. And we went to the state cross-country meet. Or no, I remember it was the first race. It was in Hampton Cove. And it was the very first race they ran. And everybody's standing on the starting line. And they actually brought out this band that played and all these other things. And, they have all these things. I've learned also, too, that they feed you all kinds of crazy food at the end. Thinking after you run, would you really want to eat, 12 dozen donuts and 14, bagels and Bojangles biscuits? I don't know, but that's what they do. So anyways, which is unique in itself, too, as well. But I can remember the thing is, so you get there, they get ready, they get on the mark, they start, and everybody cheers. I grew up very competitive, okay? I just want you to know this. I grew up very competitive to the point that it's fine to cheer, but you only cheer for your team. And in these moments, and so much so that I can tell you, listen, I pray every week that the University of Kentucky loses. I do. I pray every week to the Lord. I know Jake's shocked by that. And I don't pray for him. I pray for them. I pray them. And I pray that he's rescued one day. He comes to the side of the Lord and recognizes that Jesus is for the. No, I'm just playing. That's not true. God, I'm sorry. Please forgive me for my sin that I just committed there. But we don't. We would joke with my mom growing up. My mom was like, well, cheer for them when they're not playing Louisville. And we're like, no, you can't do that. That's ungodly. Like if I, as an Alabama fan, nor an Auburn fan, we won't discuss the wins and losses of the weekend. Surprises or unsurprises of what they were. But you don't cheer for the other side. Not if you're a real fan, right? You just don't do, who would do that? There's some people that are conflicted. They cheer for the SEC. We'll pray about them when we get to eternity. I don't even know what you do with that. But those are those things. And so anyways, let's get to the point. Here's the point. So they get on this race, and we run to certain points to get to there to cheer, what I assume is my runners, which are my boys, and I'm cheering for them. And then I start noticing this weird phenomenon. Is everybody seems to be cheering for everybody. And I'm like, this is the strangest thing I've ever seen. Because, I'll be honest, I don't care if everybody else falls on the course. As long as my boys finish first, that's all I care about. I got to be honest, because that's the way I grew up. I didn't know there's this other way. I didn't know there were weird things that people did in running that, hey, when my kids go past the finish line, I'm like, yeah, I'm going nuts. And so, but all these other people are cheering for them too. And I'm like, well, that's kind of strange. And then, they don't stop. They keep on, for every kid that goes across the line as they're finishing, they're cheering for them too. And I'm like, this is so weird. Who cheers for the opponents as well? Because I always assumed, good people finish first, losers finish last. And I'm like, I don't understand. And they don't stop. They continue to cheer every time a kid comes down. You see them coming up over this thing. And I'm just like, this is so crazy. But it's that whole idea of everybody being motivated at the end because everybody wants everybody to finish. And I believe that's the same thing in the life of faith. That's why if you go back and read Hebrews 11, there's all those people, and they're all cheering, and now there's this great crowd of witnesses that are surrounding all of us that are cheering, and one day we'll walk into heaven, and they'll continue to cheer when we get there because, hey, they're thrilled because we finished the race. And as a church, could you imagine for a moment a church where we all ran the race together? And we encouraged each other all the way along the way to fix our eyes on Jesus. That when one stumbles, we don't go, I'm sorry about your luck, and we keep on rolling. But instead we say, hey, we pick you up and we run and we pace the race together. Because sometimes you may have lost your eyes on the prize. You may have gotten distracted along the way. You may have allowed some weights to hinder you down. And I need to come alongside you and say, hey, we can keep going. To keep you at pace, the pace that you were meant to run the race at. And that we'd be a church and a place where we could encourage one another. When we stumble, when we fall, we lift each other up. Where perseverance is celebrated, that you may be in the worst season of your life, but we say keep going. Because there is a greater joy that's to come. The pain may last for a night. The suffering may last for a while. But joy comes in the morning. And that is the truth of the gospel and the hope that we have in Jesus. That for the joy set before Him, He endured the cross for us. And I believe the impact that we could have on this community when we, as a community of faith, endure and build our endurance with joy and hope, even in hardship, I believe it stands out to a weary world. And we can become a testimony of the power of Christ's presence in our lives when we endure even the greatest struggle. Because our eyes are not on the struggle, but instead they're on the person of Jesus. And I encourage you with that today. So let's commit to one, being together, this cloud of witnesses here together for one another, to cheer each other on as we run the race of life and faith. What could it look like to the world? Jesus ran the race. He completed the race, and He paved the way for us. And as we fix our eyes on Him, we find the strength to endure and the joy to keep going. So let's run this race together, knowing that with Jesus, we are never alone. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, I thank You that You provided the way. That You're the one that started the race and You're the one who completed the race. And because of that, we can keep our eyes on You as we run the race, and we can experience the same perseverance because we watched You do it. We saw how You went through it, and we do not grow weary because of that, but instead we're encouraged because You made it. And God, You're cheering us on to keep going. Your Spirit's within us if we know You. And God, for that person maybe who's here tonight, and they're in the midst of a hardship, they're in the midst of a struggle, they're in the midst of suffering, or maybe even pain or loss. Could be mental, emotional, spiritual. I don't know where they're at. But I pray in the midst of this moment right now that they'd be encouraged, that they can lift their eyes from their problems and fix their eyes on You. And God, You can give them a new perspective because You endured the shame. You endured the cross. You endured suffering on our behalf. You endured it at the hand from sinful people. And because You did, with Your strength, we can. But we need You. And Lord, for somebody in this room who's going through it, I pray that You give them the strength they need to run the race that You've set before them. And maybe somebody has some weight that they need to lay down tonight. Maybe it's even good things that by the world's measure they go, oh, that's good. But it's not their good because it's stealing Your great of what You want to do in their life. And I pray that we would take off anything that could be weighing us from running the race. God, any sin, maybe there's somebody that's going through, they've been wrestling with some stuff that maybe nobody even knows about. And they would seek You out this evening to take that away, to lay that sin down at the foot of the cross, so that they can find freedom and joy. And maybe they need somebody else, though, with them, and to encourage them, to pray with them, to remind them to keep going. I pray that God, maybe that would be their next step. Would to be open and vulnerable enough to say, here's the struggle. Here's the thing that's been weighing me down. I need somebody else to pick me up. Because we've been tripping over that. That God, You would do a work within us tonight. And somebody who maybe their gaze has been down at the struggle and the problems and the heartache and pain. Maybe the greatest reminder for them this evening was that they're not alone. and that they would lift their eyes to the Creator and Maker, the one who endured the cross, that for the joy that was set before him, endured those things, that we would have the strength, that we would have the hope in you, Jesus, that we would raise our gaze to you and focus our eyes on you, the one who's worthy, the one who ran the race and completed it. Because what you start, you finish. We love you, Jesus. Speak to us now in this moment. Move in us today. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Well, as we respond and sing this song of worship, if the Lord's stirring in your heart, I encourage you, you're welcome to come and pray. If you want here in the front, if you need somebody to pray with you, I'll be there in the back. I would love nothing more than to do that. If you need to lay down some weight tonight, I pray that you do that before you walk out of this room, that we would just be obedient. And maybe as you sing and worship, you just raise your gaze and you fix your eyes on Jesus, the one who completed the race. The one who completed the race today. Let's stand together. Let's sing the song of worship.